Okay. So in this review, I have like important aspects about blood, cardiovascular, and blood vessels. It, I think it's important to say that it doesn't have all the information. You still have to go over his slides, go over your notes, go over the recordings if you have it. But I do think that if you're in a rush, sorry, or you have something to do and the only thing you can do is go over the review, it helps out a lot because it goes into specifics of things that are for sure important that you know. So let's start with blood. So in what's the normal pH of blood? Your normal pH of blood should be between 7.35 and 7.45. Very important aspect to know about blood is what does it do, right? So we know that blood is a specialized fluid and it has a lot of functions. It transports dissolved substances, right? Like oxygen and carbon dioxide, right? It regulates pH ions, and you're going to see that a lot when you see kidneys, when you see your urinary system, you're going to see how it's going to regulate the amount of bicarbonates that you have in your body. So you're going to see that in your urinary system. Then the restriction of fluid losses at injury sites. So we know that blood has proteins like fibrinogen that are going to help you in your process of clotting. And there's certain diseases that you have or certain poisonous things that if you ingest them, for example, I don't know, like there's rat poisoning that if you ingest that, you're probably not going to produce vitamin K and you may bleed out. You may have a hemorrhage. And that's because you're not clothing, you're not doing the process of clothing. So very important that part and aspect. So then you have the defense against toxins and pathogens because in the end you have your white blood cells, which are very important to fight infections, and you're going to see that in the next topic you're going to see, which is lymphatic system and the immune system, and you're going to see all the things that your white blood cells do for you and how they protect you against infections and what is the function uh, when you have an inflammation or something like that. And then the stabilization of your body temperature because, well, blood absorbs the heat that your active skeletal muscles produce. So blood is going to help you out to have that homeostasis and keep your body at a normal temperature. So blood cell production. You know that you have erythrocytes, and the erythrocytes eventually, once they start forming, right, they're going to get to a point that their nucleus is going to get removed. So when you remove that nucleus, right, you don't have a form of repairing. They don't have a repair mechanism. So that's why your red blood cells are going to live only an average of 120 days, and then they're going to be recycled, right? They're going to be phagocytized, and we're going to see that in another slide, and we're going to see what happens to that red blood cells when it's broken down. And the reason why they're going to have that average life of 120 days is because of their lack of nucleus, right? So you always start from a stem cell, right? In this case, it's your myeloid stem cells. And between 1 and 7 days, you're going to produce that mature red blood cells, right? And you're going to have first a pro-erythroblast, then an erythroblast, then a normal blast. Your nucleus gets removed, and you have a reticulocyte, right? That is the only immature part of the red blood cell that does not contain the nucleus. Everything else contains the nucleus. It's removed, then you have the reticulocyte, and you go and you form your mature red blood cell, right? So erythrocytes, right, and the erythrocyte production is called erythropoiesis, and it's stimulated by EPO, which is a hormone called erythropoietin. And well, you need to understand that there's some things that are required for you to do this to get red blood cells. You need amino acids, irons, and vitamin B12, B6, and folic acid. If you have a lack of any of this, like vitamin B12, And we're going to see that in pernicious anemia, which is a lack of vitamin B12. You can have a form of anemia where you're not producing healthy red blood cells, or you're producing less red blood cells because you're lacking the materials to do this, right? So EPO is important, knowing that hormone, and knowing what do you require to do erythropoiesis. Okay, any questions? If anybody has questions, just let me know. Okay, so kind of a recap there. So to produce erythrocytes, you have hematopoiesis, which is blood cell formation, and that happens in your red bone marrow, and it also happens in the spleen and the liver. And your hemocytoblasts give rise to all your form elements. You're always going to have kind of a stem cell where every other cell is going to derive. For example, your platelets come from a megakaryocyte. So that is a stem cell from where you get all the platelets in the blood. Then they ask you what is the most abundant white blood cell. And those are the neutrophils. And does anybody know what the neutrophils do?
They fight off against bacteria?
Yes, they are in general, generally very important as phagocytes. They're going to engulf pathogens, so they're very important for your immune system. So neutrophils are very abundant. They're the most abundant white blood cells. And again, this part that I have here, you don't. I'm gonna go over it. You don't need to know it very specifically, but it's kind of an intro, because then you're gonna go to the lymphatic system and you're gonna see which what is the function of each of these things that you see here. So they ask you what are the major T lymphocytes, right? So you have CD4 and CD8, and you're going to see the difference. Right now, you don't need to know that, but you should know that T lymphocytes are there to fight infection and to coordinate that immune response. And some types of T lymphocytes are killer T cells and T helper cells. And T helper cells are very important because they're not only going to activate killer T cells, but they also activate B cells, which are the ones that are going to produce eventually your antibodies. So in general, just know that T helper cells and killer T cells are types of lymphocytes, which are important for your immune response, right? Then they ask you what is the most abundant protein in blood, and that would be albumin. Okay, so here's in this part, they have a lot of definitions that have them there, so you know them. What is whole blood? And the whole blood is just the blood that flows in your body. Nothing is separated from it or removed. That's the whole blood. Then when you have the serum, that is a yellow fluid that remains from blood plasma after your clotting factors, which are fibrinogen and prothrombin, have been removed by clot formation. So after you do clot formation, you end up with this yellow fluid. That is your serum. You should know the difference between whole blood and serum. One of those vitamins used for clotting, that's vitamin K that I told you about. Rat poison, that you shouldn't drink that. And well, it's cruel to rats because that happens to rats too. If you give it to the rat, they're probably going to have a hemorrhage. Well, that is because they're affecting that vitamin K. They're not able to do proper clotting and they die, right? So what happens to your damaged erythrocytes? Because we know that they're going to last for 120 days because they don't have a nucleus, right? So they cannot repair themselves. What's going to happen to those erythrocytes is that they're going to be engulfed. And they're going to be engulfed by a macrophage in either your spleen, your liver, or your bone marrow. And they're going to be broken down into amino acids, right? And when they're broken down into amino acids, you're going to get the heme group, which is iron. And that iron is going to be transported by transferring to your bone marrow or even to the spleen or liver where they're going to be stored, right? And whatever is left of that red blood cells, you're going to make biliverdin, right? That heme is going to break down into iron and biliverdin. That biliverdin is eventually going to get converted into bilirubin, and bilirubin goes to your liver, right? And you know that in the gallbladder you store bili, right? So that villi that is stored in your liver and your gallbladder eventually is going to get to your duodenum and then your large intestine, right? And when it goes to your large intestine, it's going to become that bilirubin is going to become stercobilins, right? And stercobilins are kind of what it sounds like. It gives the color of feces. And then bilirubin also goes to your kidneys, where it's going to be and with the right products, which is going to be urobilins, which gives the color to again, but like not feces, but now urine, right? So do you guys get that? They get engulfed, they get broken down. Iron is stored, and then biliverdin converts it to bilirubin, and then you go to the liver, and then you go to the kidneys and your large intestine. You got that? I know it's a lot.
Yeah.
You got that? Okay, awesome. That's important. You should know what happens. So, well, here I have like a note that you should focus a lot when you go into blood vessels. You should know slides 14, 16, 17, and 18 because they contain a lot of important information and I put them there to go over them, right? So, you know that blood pressure in your, well, in your body is extremely important because you want to maintain a normal blood pressure, right? So they're telling you which are the main factors in general that are going to influence that blood pressure, which are cardiac output, right? That depends on what? Does anybody know what cardiac output depends on?
Your heart rate and stroke volume.
Exactly. So your heart rate times your stroke volume is going to give you that cardiac output. That's the amount of milliliters that your heart pushes out in 1 minute, right? So then you have the peripheral resistance that in general, when you have high blood pressure, you generally have a high peripheral resistance. It goes kind of the same way. The resistance had to do with diameter. It had to do with how long that blood vessel is. And if you have anything that could be clotting it, right? Like a thrombus or a bolus that could be blocking if your blood goes there or if the blood is lacking water. What happens if your blood lacks water?
It's thick and it's not as fluid.
Exactly. You have more solutes. So if you have more solutes and you have less water, it's more sticky and it's going to increase that peripheral resistance that you in general don't want. You want to maintain a normal blood pressure. So that peripheral resistance is very important in those blood vessels to know if that blood pressure is going to increase or decrease. And then you have the amount of blood, which is blood volume. And that again has to do with the amount of water you have. If you have more water, you're probably going to have, if you're retaining more water, you're probably going to have a higher blood pressure, right? And that's why foods like, I don't know, hamburgers or very high in sodium content foods tend to increase that blood pressure because you're retaining sodium. And if you retain sodium, you retain water. Water is the answer, but okay. So how you maintain your blood pressure, right? So your blood pressure is maintained by a lot of things, right? You have short-term controls and you have long-term controls. Your short-term controls are going to depend on epinephrine and norepinephrine, which have to do with adrenaline, have to do with your adrenal medulla, right? And they're going to increase. They're related with your sympathetic nervous system, so they're going to increase your heart rate, and they're going to increase that blood pressure, and everything is kind of like a chain reaction of everything that you get there, right? And your long-term controls are the renin, angiotensin aldosterone, and ADH. They take longer to have an effect, but aldosterone and ADH are going to retain water. So when you retain water in your body, again, you increase the amount, well, aldosterone actually retains sodium, which retains water, which is going to increase the amount of blood you have in your system, and you are going to eventually have more blood, right? So in your heart, right, you have the blood vessels. You have the aorta, you have carotid. And you have there your coronary nerve number 10 and number 9, which have baro, which are pressure receptors and chemoreceptors. And they're going to know and know, well, if your baro and your pressure, you know, if you have a high blood pressure, right? Those coronary nerves are going to detect that, right? Then you have your kidneys, which have the renin of the angiotensin aldosterone, because kidneys are going to kind of work in your favor. If you have high blood pressure, right, and you want to decrease the amount of blood pressure that you have, you're probably going to pee. If you want to retain it, you are going to avoid peeing. The renin-angiotensin aldosterone, well, ADH in general, has an effect on kidney tubules that you're going to see that later. And that effect is going to help you. You're going to open certain pores in that tube and you're going to get water in, right? So you're going to retain water. Your kidneys have a lot to do in how much water you retain in your body, which is going to affect that blood pressure, right? Then you have cooperation of your heart. You have AMP, MP, and those are hormones that you have in your heart. And if you have high blood pressure, those hormones there are going to help you out to pee. They are diuretic. They do the contrary effect of ADH. They actually want you to release that and get rid of the extra amount of water, right? And epinephrine, we already said it, which has to do with your adrenaline, and in general has to do with the sympathetic nervous system. You should know what sympathetic nervous system does and parasympathetic nervous system do, because during the whole semester you're going to see the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, right? They're always going to affect other things in your body, because if you're in sympathetic, you're in fight or flight mode, right? You're probably not gonna pee. Your adrenaline is high. You are with high blood pressure. You're moving. You're doing a lot of stuff. Parasympathetic is where your digestion occurs. Is in the moment that you pee, that you relax. Your body is not in a constant moment of stress. And it's very important because in that part you can do other processes that are very important. Well, like digestion and stuff. So we're gonna go to the next page. So here I'm going to kind of go over the renin-angiotensin aldosterone that you probably saw in endocrine system, but again, you're gonna see it the rest of the semester, so we're gonna go over it again. So you guys know what renin is, which is an enzyme that comes from your kidneys. Angiotensin is a peptide hormone, and aldosterone is a hormone produced in your adrenal cortex. Do you guys remember in which part of the adrenal cortex was it produced? GFR?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Do you guys remember in what part of the adrenal cortex was it produced? Remember, you have zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. In what part was aldosterone produced?
In the reticularis?
Not exactly. So remember, you had in the zona glomerulosa, you have the mineralocorticoids, which are where you have cortisol, and those are the ones that produce aldosterone, right? So it's in the zona glomerulosa where you have it. And what are the hormones that are going to increase that blood pressure? So aldosterone and ADH are the ones that increase your blood pressure, and we're gonna see how they do it through here, right? So we already here in this, they ask you what's the function of AMP. You know that AMP and BMP, which are in the heart, are hormones that work as diuretics. They're gonna make you pee. They do the contrary effect as ADH and aldosterone, and they are important to maintain, again, your blood pressure, right? So here in this sketch, we have what happens in the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, and what effects does it have? So first, you have your liver releases angiotensinogen. And angiotensinogen, you know that when it says inogen is that it's not activated. So the kidneys are going to release renin. And renin is the one that's going to convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Once you have angiotensin 1, the angiotensin converting enzyme, which is ACE, that comes from the pulmonary blood, right? It's going to convert into angiotensin 2. And then angiotensin 2 is going to eventually produce aldosterone. And aldosterone has this effect that I told you about. You're going to see it later with more specific, but it's going to stimulate sodium and water reabsorption in the nephron, right? And when you do that, you're going to start retaining water, right? So aldosterone has a lot of effects, not only in your kidneys, because you're going to retain sodium and water, but that's going to increase your blood pressure, right? And aldosterone also increases vasoconstriction. This has to do with resistance, right? As smaller the diameter of those arteries, because when you vasoconstrict, you're making that diameter smaller, you are increasing that blood pressure. So you're not only increasing the amount of sodium and water you have, but you're also vasoconstricting your arteries. So aldosterone is doing all these effects that eventually are going to increase that blood pressure, right? And here they have like an explanation of what happens if you have a homeostasis disturbed, right? So when your homeostasis is normal, homeostasis. That word really hard to pronounce for me. My bad. So when you have it normal, right, you shouldn't be needing anything external to happen, right? But when you actually decrease the blood pressure and your volume, right, you're going to have those short-term effects and those long-term effects. Does anybody remember what were the short-term effects? And it has to do with neural response. No, yes, no. Okay, I'm gonna take it as a no. So short-term effects have to do with your neural response, right? You're gonna stimulate two things, which are your baroreceptors and your chemoreceptors in the heart. And they're gonna stimulate your cardiovascular centers, right? And you are going to produce, right, peripheral vasoconstriction. The other thing that you do is that you're gonna have a sympathetic activation. When those that neural response, when those baroreceptors and chemoreceptors get stimulated, they're going to make your sympathetic nervous system be like, okay, we need to produce something, right? And what does generally your sympathetic activation do? They produce adrenaline. They're gonna stimulate your adrenal medulla to produce epinephrine and norepinephrine, and that's the part that is going to do the peripheral vasoconstriction, and you're going to increase your blood pressure. Now, then you have the long-term ones, which were ADH and the angiotensin-aldosterone system, that in the end, they're going to elevate the amount of blood volume that you're going to have. And that's going to increase your cardiac output, and you're going to increase the blood pressure and volume. So remember that you have two ways, right? Long-term and short-term, of elevating the blood volume and stimulating vasoconstriction to eventually get to a normal blood pressure, right? Now here they have a slide, pretty sure he went over it, which is your three tunics. So all your blood vessels, right, are going to have this three tunics, which are tunica interna, media, and externa. Tunica interna, right, it's the one that is exposed to your blood, right, the one's in contact with blood. Tunica media is very important because it's the one, it's like your muscle here, right? So it's the one that consists of smooth muscle, collagen, and elastic tissue. So tunica media is an extremely important part of the structure because it is your muscular layer. It's going to have, it's going to strengthen that vessel, right? It's going to prevent blood pressure from rupturing them because you know that in arteries you have very strong pressure, right? So you need something that keeps blood inside without rupturing there. And it's going to change the diameter of blood vessels brought about by smooth muscle. So smooth muscle may increase or decrease in size depending on that blood pressure. So a lot of things happen in that tunica media. And then you have the tunica externa that is going to consist of loose connective tissue, and you see it right here. Interesting that the aorta is the biggest artery in your body, and it actually has its own blood supply, which is the vasa vasorum is the one that gives the blood supply to that aorta because it's so big and, well, so important. Basically, it's because it's really big. You guys are getting it? Remember tunica media, it's very important. So let's go to the next page. So here in this part, we have kind of what are arteries, what are veins, and what are capillaries, right? So what are arteries? When they tell you about arteries, what do you think about? What are some characteristics that you know for sure that arteries have? And there's a table here, so you could even read it.
They transport oxygenated blood.
They what?
Oh, wait, I'm confused. Hold on.
No, it's just that I couldn't listen. What did you say? Hello?
No,
Arteries,
problems with my laptop. Sorry.
Okay.
arteries take blood away from the heart, while as veins take blood to the heart.
Okay, that's a very good definition. It's actually a very a better definition than the one that I have here because I did this review I think last semester. I should change the definition of arteries here because you do have moments in veins at least that and in arteries, which are the pulmonary ones, where pulmonary veins actually carry oxygenated blood. So this is the common rule, I guess, that generally arteries are the ones that carry oxygenated blood and veins are the ones that carry deoxygenated blood. But you do have exceptions. We have to do with your pulmonary veins and your pulmonary arteries. So that definition of carrying blood away and into the heart is actually a better definition. I'll probably change it before I send it to you guys. But yeah, that's what they do. And then you have your capillaries, which are the smallest blood vessels. And here you have a difference, a table, right? Which has the difference between arteries, veins, and capillaries. And the most important differences are mostly in the lumen and if they carry the valves. And here you see the exception part, because arteries generally carry oxygenated blood, except your pulmonary artery, and your veins carry deoxygenated blood, except your pulmonary vein. Veins have a large lumen. Why? Does anybody remember from class why do veins have a large lumen and arteries have a small lumen? And why arteries have a muscular wall while veins have a thinner wall? They have to do with each other. No? No one? So veins deal with volume and arteries deal with pressure, right? So veins have thinner walls because in general, the amount of blood that you're gonna have there, it won't have overwhelming pressure that could rupture those walls, right? And they have a large lumen because they need a space where they can carry all that blood. In the other hand, you have arteries, and arteries have thick muscular walls because, again, that tunica media needs to hold on to all that blood that's inside, and it cannot let that pressure rupture it, right? And it has a small lumen because in the end, it's going to have less volume than the veins, right? And another very important difference is that your arteries do not have semilunar valves. Veins have semilunar valves, and those valves are going to prevent the blood from backflow, right? So when you do a venous return, you don't want blood to come back. So those valves are gonna close while that blood moves up your body. And you have three factors that have to do with it. It has to do with breathing. It has to do with skeletal muscles, that when you move, those skeletal muscles are going to help out that venous return by kind of pushing veins together. And those valves are the ones that are not going to let that blood backflow. You have, what are the types of capillaries? You have three main ones, the ones that he talks about, which are continuous, which are uninterrupted, fenestrated, and fenestrated just means that it has pores. So if you have pores, you're probably gonna allow larger molecules to go through, other solutes. And discontinuous is that they have a wide diameter. And these are mostly to the point question, that is, what is a blood vessel at the L4? That is vertebrae, the lumbar 4, that's the abdominal aorta. And the just arterial branch are called precapillary arterioles. Note, I would learn the order of how you go from arteries to veins. I would learn that order. He has a slide. I don't have it here, but he has a slide of how you go from arteries to like veins. So I would learn that. So the heart. First, they ask you where diffusion takes place, and they tell you it's the capillaries, because they contain thin, flat cells that can readily diffuse gases. And you see those in the alveoli. And capillaries are the one, they're so thin that probably just one cell can go at a time. And capillaries are where you're gonna have that diffusion taking place. Then here they ask you what is the flow of blood. And if you already took the lab exam, I don't know if everybody took it, you probably already know this because you needed to know it for the test. And it just asks you what is the blood flow. So you go from your inferior and superior vena cava, you enter your right atrium, then you go through your bicuspid valve to your right ventricle, right? Then you go through your pulmonary semilunar valve, you pass through your pulmonary trunk, right? And you go to your pulmonary arteries, and in this case, you know, they are blue because the lungs are the exception to the rule. And you go to the lungs, right, where you do the gas exchange, and we're going to see that in respiratory system. And you come back with oxygenated blood, which is going to enter through your pulmonary veins to your left atrium, which is going to go through your bicuspid valve to your left ventricle, which is, and you can see it in the picture, thicker than your right ventricle. Does anybody know why? Why is this ventricle thicker?
Because it's the one that's pumping blood out into the system, out into and through to the system.
Also, you remember you're carrying oxygenated blood, and that it has more pressure than this blood right here, right? So yeah, you need a thicker ventricle so you can push all of that blood into your circulatory system, right? So then you go through your aortic semilunar valve, and from the aortic semilunar valve, you go to your aorta, and then you go to systemic circulation, right? So that is the kind of blood. It's just knowing how your blood enters your heart, goes through the heart, goes to your lungs, then back to your heart, then to your systemic circulation, right? That's important. You should know that in order, right? So then they ask you here to explain the blood supply to the myocardium. You know that the heart has its own arteries, which are coronary arteries, that are going to supply blood, right? So when you're doing ventricular vessel, which is that you're filling up with blood, your coronary arteries are going to give some blood to that myocardium that you have there, that muscle that you have in your heart, right? Then they ask you what's backflow, And backflow is a regurgitation, is blood flow in the opposite direction from normal, right? So if your bulbs in your heart weren't working as they should, you would be getting backflow, thing that you really, really don't want. So if you have a problem with any heart bulb, you're probably going to get surgery for it. Then you have what are aortic baroreceptors and carotid baroreceptors. And we talked about it when we talked about blood vessels. We know that you have baroreceptors, which are receptors for pressure, which are in your aorta, and then carotid baroreceptors are receptors again for pressure in your carotids. Okay, then we also talked about this, which, well, over it, which was cardiac output, stroke volume, and diastolic volume, right? So end-diastolic volume is the volume of blood that each ventricle contains at the end of ventricular filling. So it's how much, when you're filling those ventricles, how much volume you get in, right? You're going to have about 130 milliliters, right? And you have that amount of blood that then you're going to push out of the heart, right? So there's where stroke volume comes in, right? It's the volume of blood that each ventricle ejects during ventricular ejection, right? So how much blood you're going to get out of your heart. And then that cardiac output, it has to do with heart rate and stroke volume, and it's the amount of blood pumped by the left ventricle in 1 minute. So cardiac output is how much blood you're getting out of that of your heart in 1 minute. Okay? Then they ask you about what are the waves in your EKG, right? So you could learn it like this, or you could just go to the isovolumetric ventricular filling and go over the diagram he has, because I know he has that. If you want to go, and it's easier just knowing what each of them mean, I put it here small, but you could also go over his slides where he has a more thorough explanation of why the P wave corresponds to depolarization, or the QRS corresponds to ventricular depolarization. He has a more specific explanation of that. But in the end, I'm going to go over what I have here, which is that as the name suggests, your QRS complex includes the Q wave, R wave, and S wave, right? And the QRS complex is going to represent the electrical impulse as it spreads through the ventricles and indicates ventricular depolarization. So here you have what each of the waves of your electrocardiography means what. Your P wave has to do with depolarization of the SA node, right? And you know that in the SA node you have the pacemaker cells, right? And those pacemaker cells are the ones that are going to initiate that electrical impulse, and they're the ones that have the pacemaker cells, right? They make their own action potential. Then you have the QRS complex, which corresponds to ventricular depolarization, right? And then the T wave, which corresponds to ventricular repolarization. And that atrial repolarization that you have here, you can actually not see it because the QRS complex masks it. It's so like you cannot see it because the QRS complex is too major. So atrial repolarization is not something that you could check in that electrocardiography, right? So then we have a question that asks you about what happens during the repolarization phase. So you know that you have two types of cells, right? You have in the SA node, you have the pacemaker cells, right? And then you have the contractile cells that are going to be in the rest of that electric system. And what happens in the pacemaker cells, it's different to what happens in the other types of cells. Because pacemaker cells make their own action potential. So they work different. You know that, I don't know if you guys saw the video of cardiac action potential that he has. You should see it, you should rewatch it and watch it again because it helps out. And if you saw kind of the graph they had, the depolarization and everything of your pacemaker cells was kind of just a it was kind of a normal graph that goes up and goes down. And then the contractile cells have like a phase that they stay stable, which is like a plateau. So right now, maybe you don't see it, but there's a graph that tells you that. And it's because pacemaker cells and contractile cells are gonna kind of work different. And these questions have to do with that. They ask you what happens during the depolarization phase. And depolarization phase in pacemaker cells happens because you have an Na and calcium influx. So you have that influx and you go up, right? And that happens in your SA node. Now, in your AV node, which has the contractile cells, it's just the sodium influx. The sodium influx is the one that's going to generate that action potential, and it's going to increase. Right? And then calcium ions have different functions in your SA node than in your AV node. In the SA node, it has to do with depolarization, like we said here. Na and calcium together are the ones that are going to cause that depolarization in your SA node, where you have the pacemaker cells. But in your AV node, where you have the different type of cells, you're going to have a plateau phase. That is the phase that I'm telling you that it gets kind of the same. I don't know, but I think there's a option that I can do a draw. Yeah, I can do that. So it looks like this one's SA, and it looks like that, kind of like that, when it's AV node. And I don't know why it's in the same spot. So that would be your SA node, and this would be your AV node. Okay, somewhere it does. It's really hard to use the screen here for some reason. That it looks like this. And this part here, well, not that one. Okay, awesome. This part here, the part that it actually is like this, because I can't draw apparently. Well, that part that it stays like a plateau, like this, it doesn't go up, it doesn't go down, it just stays like that. That is because of calcium ions in that plateau phase. Okay, I hope that made sense. Sorry for the drawings. So then they ask you about membrane permeability, and membrane permeability is just a quality that your cell membranes have, which is going to permit or not like the passage of solvents and solutes. And membrane permeability in general is going to let you know if you can do depolarization or you can't, because that passage of solvents such as sodium and calcium are the ones that actually change that membrane permeability, and they're going to generate an action potential. So the heart rate and how it's in control. So when you were in anatomy 1, you knew about in your brain the medulla oblongata, and the medulla oblongata is actually going to control a lot of the autonomic functions of your body. So those involuntary actions that we know as heart rate are controlled by your medulla oblongata, right? And they're going to affect the heart rate, the PNS and CNS. And we talked about the sympathetic and parasympathetic may affect that medulla oblongata and make that heart rate go up or go down, right? Then they ask you about what are Purkinje fibers, and you know that they are fibers, right, that send the electrical impulse to your ventricles through the myocardium. So you have first the SA node, then you go to the AV node, then you go to the bundle of His, then you go to the branches of the bundle of His, and then you get to those Purkinje fibers, right? They're going to send that impulse. And this is a question that we already went over, which was, why is the left ventricle thicker than the right one? And it is due to the higher forces needed to pump blood through the systemic circuit, right? The right ventricle only has to pump blood to your lungs. So the distance is shorter. Therefore, less pressure is required. You need a strong, thick ventricle to make that blood, that cardiac output, get to your whole systemic circuit, right? And then we're going to get to the last part of this, which is the pathologies. And pathologies are very important in this topic because, well, he likes asking about them. So that's a hit. So the first pathology we're going to talk about is pernicious anemia. And pernicious anemia is a condition in which the body can make enough healthy red blood cells because it doesn't have enough vitamin 12. So we knew that to make red blood cells, you need B12, B6, folic acid, amino acids, and iron, right? We need all of that. So if you have a lack of something, you are going to have problem making healthy red blood cells. Do you guys know who kind of suffers or who is a risk of not having enough vitamin B? Have you heard about it? Have any idea of who can suffer from this? Or who tends to suffer from this? Yes, no? No one? What if I give you a hint? It has to do with people that, let's say that B12 has to do, or you can find it in meat products. An
Okay.
animal.
Vegans, you're talking. The vegans are
Exactly. So people that are vegans, and it actually doesn't have to be a problem if you are conscious, because there's supplements that you can take. So if you're vegan, you just have to know that you are in risk of not getting enough vitamin B12. So you just have to take supplements. That's all. So if you're vegan or you're planning to become a vegan, just make sure you get enough vitamin B12 because your body needs that to produce healthy red blood cells. So if you're vegan and you're not taking those supplements, you're probably going to develop pernicious anemia. Other ones, other people at risk of this are people that actually get part of their stomach removed. There's a part on the top of your stomach that has those that produces intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is a protein that you need to actually absorb that vitamin B12. So if you get that part of your stomach removed, you are not going to produce intrinsic factor and you're not going to absorb vitamin B12. So they are also at risk of having pernicious anemia. Okay? Then they ask you what is sickle cell anemia, and that's a genetic blood disease due to a presence of abnormal form of hemoglobin. Okay, so called hemoglobin S. So it's just a mutation of hemoglobin which causes your cell to be kind of like an oval shaped, kind of, again, my drawing is not very nice, but it looks kind of like this. And they're thinner than they should be. And that's a horrible picture, but well. Then you have what is thrombosis and what is embolism. And here I put it very like it has kind of a bigger explanation than you have here, kind of like a small hint so you remember always which one is which. So thrombosis is when it stays there, and embolism is when it actually travels through your blood vessels. So thrombosis occurs when a thrombus, which is a blood clot, develops in your blood vessels and reduces the flow of blood through the vessel, right? So it's going to generate more or less resistance. Are thrombose and embolism going to generate more or less resistance in your blood vessels? What do you think it would do? So if you have your blood vessels and you have something that is not blood, clotting how blood moves through your blood vessels, will you have more or less resistance? More resistance, right? It makes sense because it would be exactly someone, I don't know, how, exactly. So it would generate more resistance because you have something there that shouldn't be there, right? Clotting that blood flow. And the embolism occurs when a piece of blood clot or a foreign object or other bodily substance becomes stuck in a blood vessel. And actually, both of them are very dangerous, but thrombus, which are the ones that will stay there, it's kind of, they can or clot your blood and your blood cannot pass through that part, or that can travel and block other parts of your heart, well, of the blood flow, that could be worse. So I would say that the one that travels is kind of worse, but again, both are very bad. So then they ask you what is hypertension and what is hypotension. And hyper is more, hypo is less. So hypertension is high blood pressure and hypotension is low blood pressure. And they ask you to compare it. It's just hypotension is going to be the opposite of hypertension. Nothing very complicated about that. And they ask you what is atherosclerosis and arteriosclerosis. And that also had to do with part of resistance and blood pressure, because arteriosclerosis is a stiffening or hardening of your artery walls, right? And that happens mostly over time, and it happens to old people a lot, that you may have a calcium deposit or something, and you're going to make those arteries hard, like rock. And atherosclerosis is when there's a narrowing of those arteries because you have a plaque buildup. And it has a lot to do with cholesterol. Cholesterol, you know how you have good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. Good cholesterol is going to help you get that plaque buildup as in low levels as you can. But bad cholesterol is going to help that plaque buildup. So you have to be careful, because good cholesterol could actually save you from a heart attack, and bad cholesterol could actually cause it. So atherosclerosis has a lot to do with your cholesterol, and well, both of them are pretty bad, and it has to do also with resistance, because, well, if you have a plaque buildup, it's kind of having a foreign thing there in that blood vessel, which is going to increase that resistance. Then they ask you what is cardiac tamponade, which is the compression of the heart due to critically increased volume of fluid in your pericardium, right? So pericardium, if you have too much fluid there, you're going to have a cardiac tamponade. Cardiomyopathy is a disease of the heart muscle that makes it harder for your heart to pump blood to the rest of your body. It can lead to heart failure, and the main types are dilated, hypertrophic, and restrictive cardiomyopathy, right? So that is cardiomyopathy. Then you have the mitral valve prolapse, and this has to do with your valves, right? So mitral valve prolapse is a condition in which the two valve flaps of the mitral valve do not close smoothly, right? Or they don't close evenly, because they may or not close, or just not close the way they should. And they're going to bulge, which is prolapse, and they kind of look like this. Again, the drawing part. It looks kind of like this. The bulb comes, and instead of looking like this or something like that, it's going to get bigger. It's like if you're pushing something, right? And it may go to your left atrium, right? It's going to prolapse to your left atrium, right? Then you have what is pericarditis, and I think that's itis. It's kind of an inflammation. That's another hint. Whenever you see anything that says itis, it's going to do with inflammation, and pericarditis refers to the inflammation of the pericardium, right? Two thin layers of sac-like tissue that surround the heart. You know, the pericardium is this. There's a definition of pericardium, and pericarditis is just inflammation of that pericardium. Then they ask you what is hemophilia A, and it's another page, but it's a genetic disorder that is caused by missing or defective factor 7, which is a clotting protein. So if you have hemophilia A, it's that you have a lack of that factor, factor 7, that has to do with clotting. And then they ask you what are the effects caused by the rupture of papillary muscles and chordae tendineae. And that's going to be prolapse and regurgitation, because remember that they're going to make sure those valves close correctly and do not remain open. So if you have a rupture there, you're going to have those valves not working correctly, and you're going to get prolapse and regurgitation. And finally, they ask you what enzymes do we look for during a myocardial infarction, and that's troponin. So that is the review that I have. Does anybody have any questions about it? Okay, I'm gonna take that as a no. What I'm gonna do is that someone wanted to talk.
No, I was just gonna say no questions.
Oh, okay, okay, cool, cool. So hope it was helpful. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna send an announcement probably in the next 15 minutes or so. I'm gonna send the recording. I'll send you guys this study guide. And if you guys have any questions before the test or anything, just let me know. I'll send my schedule also in the announcement. And if you guys could send me to my email your MDC ID so I can log you in because I have to log you guys in. This is my email. Because I need to let them know who attended, including Professor Garcia. I have to tell him that. And I understood by the when I started the review, I asked what days were good for you guys, and most of you guys said Fridays. So I'm gonna work it out with Dr. Garcia to see what time on Fridays we will be doing the reviews, and I'll send you guys a schedule so you guys know when the reviews are going to be taking place, and you can, I don't know, write questions if you have them. And well, I think that's all I have to say. Does anybody have anything else to say?
Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Well, hopefully it was helpful. I'll send you guys all the info. Have a nice day, and let me know if you guys have any need anything. Yes, you just have to send me the student ID. Okay,
Thank you. Have a
thanks.
good one.
You too, guys. Bye.
Thank you.